There are a million and one ways to build a bookshelf. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different options: a basic, a fancy, and a rustic version. Along the way, I'll try to squeeze in as many possible tips and customizations as I can. I'm Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and I hope you're ready to get building. This video was sponsored by Dreamy. Let's kick things off with a very basic, simple shelf design. You guys know how much I love a good plywood project, so I'm using 3/4 inch plywood here. Bookshelf depth varies. There's no standard size, but you usually find them roughly 12 inches deep. So if you prefer solid wood, 1x12 boards are a great option to build bookshelves with, since they're 11 1/4 inches wide. I ripped my plywood sheet into 2 strips, 11 1/2 inches wide for the body, and then 1 strip, 11 inches wide for the shelves. You can make your bookshelf as wide as you'd like within reason. You don't want to go too wide or your shelves will sag. In this case, I made my shelf about 27 inches wide. So I cut a 27-inch long piece off both of my wider strips of plywood for the top and the bottom, and then I used the leftover long pieces for the sides. That made my bookshelf about 69 inches tall, but you can obviously cut more plywood and make a taller shelf if you'd like. Oh, and I also cut a thin strip of plywood here to use as the toe kick. I applied edge banding to the front edges of my top, bottom, and side panels, and if you wonder if edge banding is worth it, I'm gonna say yes. It makes a huge difference. Then I sanded and drilled pocket holes to assemble. This is literally just a giant box, very similar to a cabinet, just way taller. But a giant box is a little flexible. So to make it a little more rigid, I cut a piece of 1/4 inch plywood to cover the back side. I just stapled this onto the back, and just an FYI, if you make sure that your back panel is square, you can kind of adjust the bookcase to fit it to ensure that your bookcase is also square, just like with cabinets. On taller bookcases, I usually like to add at least 1 stationary shelf between the top and the bottom just to help keep the sides from bowing or flexing over a long span. It doesn't always have to be directly in the center. It can be closer toward the top or closer toward the bottom, but in this case, it just made sense to add it in the middle. So I cut 2 adjustable shelves and 1 stationary shelf from my plywood strip, and I edge banded the front edges. Then I installed the stationary shelf using pocket holes. Now you could obviously make all of the shelves stationary and install them with pocket holes if you wanted, but I'm indecisive, so I like having the option to adjust my shelves whenever possible. So I drilled shelf pin holes along each side of my bookshelf. Also, I want to let you know that I am well aware that my back panel isn't the prettiest. I thought that I had a sheet of 1/4 inch birch, but when I looked, I only had a sheet of underlayment. I didn't want to make a trip to town just for a sheet of 1/4 inch plywood, so I used the underlayment on the back. It's not the prettiest, but it'll do. These shelf pin holes allow me to place my shelves wherever I want using shelf pins. By the way, for adjustable shelves, typically you want to cut them about 1/8 of an inch shorter than the opening so that there's a little wiggle room to get them in and out. And just like that, this simple bookshelf is complete. It's not fancy or elaborate, just a clean, quick, 1-hour build to give your books and trinkets a place to go. But if you're looking for something a little more traditional, we're gonna do that too. This second shelf is literally the bones of the first one, but with some added trim detail. Bubs was very eager to help with this one, and speaking of Bubs, I'm excited to share a little more about our video sponsor, Dreamy. It's shedding season, and while we love Bubby and Lucy, we don't love all of the hair all of the time. So the Dreamy Fur Catch FP10 air purifier is helping keep us sane. Between the pet hair and all of the sawdust, which I'll admit I'm definitely part of the problem, we're all a bit of a mess. What's unique about this air purifier is that it doesn't just sit there, it actively pulls in the floating hair and dust instead of just passively waiting for it to drift in. So it can grab fur and dust right out of the air before it has time to even settle on your sofa or your clothes, unlike regular air purifiers. And everything collects right here in this chamber. You can see when it's full, dump it out, rinse it, and then you're done. No more gross filter cleaning or paying for endless replacements. Its 4-stage filtration system, which includes an H14 HEPA filter, also helps with the stuff that you don't see, like dust, pollen, and pet dander, plus odors like the litter box, smoke, or just lingering smells from cooking dinner. So the air just overall feels cleaner. It runs super quiet and it even automatically detects when pets approach to reduce fan speed to avoid scaring them. And I love that it actually looks nice, so it blends right into the room with its modern, sleek design. Check out the Dreamy FP10 air purifier at the link in the video description. Right now it's 30% off for the spring sale, plus you can use my code for an extra savings. Let's dive back into this bookshelf build. For the second style, I opted to use primed pine for my trim pieces. I always like to buy wider boards and rip them down, but you can definitely just buy these already ripped to size if you don't have or want to use a table saw. In this case, I cut down 1x6s into two 1.5-inch strips to make 1x2s, and the leftover piece was about 2.25 inches wide, which is almost a 1x3.
Do what?
He bit you twice. Did you provoke it?
No!
I think he provoked it.
All I did was rub his little head.
You don't bite people, do you, Bug? I always sand every piece of every project, even the primed pieces, before assembling. I know that these videos don't always show me every time I sand, because if I did, it would literally be 50% of the video. But sanding makes or breaks a project, so I always take the time to sand. After sanding, I glued and nailed my 1x2s vertically onto the sides of my bookshelf. So around the top of the bookshelf, I'm planning to add some additional molding. So I didn't want there to just be a tiny lip of trim underneath it. I wanted there to be like a little bit of trim. So I made the top piece wider. So this is about 2.5 inches, so which it would be like a 1x3. So that's what I'm gonna use here at the top. The same applies for down here at the bottom. So I want my bottom piece on the face frame, like on the front, I want it to come up just above this bottom shelf. So if I decide to add some baseboard to it, where I have plenty of room to add the baseboard, but either way, I do at least want my face frame to cover the front edge of the shelf. So I'm going to match that on the bottom. Again, I don't have to. I could put a 1x2 here. I just think it would look kind of funny if I had like a 1x2 here and then like a wider piece here. So I measured this and I added 1/8 of an inch, and I think that was 4 3/8. So I had to custom cut this just because I'm working with what I have already. But for the middle, I am actually cutting a 1x2 piece. You can customize the trim here a million different ways. You can use wider boards for a chunkier look, or you could also line the inside openings with additional molding like cove molding. Feel free to get as fancy as you would like. Once the trim was added to both sides, I needed to add a face frame onto the front. The front edges here are about 1.5 inches wide, so you could use a 1x2 for the face frame sides, but it would be flush to the inside edge. I just wanted a little overhang. I don't know why, just personal preference. So I opted to use a wider board, like a 1x3 for my face frame sides. And just like the trim on the bookshelf sides, I cut a 1x3 for the top and a 4 3/8 inch wide piece for the bottom of my face frame. That way everything matches along the front and the sides. I assembled my face frame using pocket holes and screws before gluing and nailing it onto the front of the shelf. Sometimes people ask why I assemble the face frame together before attaching it, as opposed to just nailing the individual pieces onto the front. Again, it's just a personal preference, but I do feel like the joints always come together a lot cleaner that way, and I feel like the face frame being attached together helps make the box more rigid. I'm really picky about my trim joints being flush, so I carefully sanded all of my trim so that the joints were flush, then I applied wood filler along each one. I always want my trim to look as seamless as possible. After the filler dried, I sanded it again, then I could finally move on to adding some more trim. Crown molding is a great option for the top of a bookshelf, but I didn't have any on hand, so I opted to use some base cap molding since I had some scraps. That said, feel free to use whatever type of trim detail that you'd like here. I cut to fit my trim pieces around the top of the shelf, mitering the corners 45 degrees. Then I did the same thing using baseboard molding around the bottom. And just like that, this plain bookshelf has transformed to a fancy bookshelf. Like I said at the beginning, there are a million and one ways to make a bookshelf, but this is one of my personal favorites. Now for the third, what I'm calling rustic style shelf, I'm making this one a bit differently. Unlike the other two, this one will have legs, and I'm using 2x2s for those. I cut my 2x2s into 4 pieces to make 4 legs, and I tapered the ends of the front 2 legs just to add some extra detail. Then I cut 2 3/4 inch plywood side panels. Now, I'll confess, I installed these side panels using pocket holes because I was in a hurry and I didn't have time to wait for any glue to dry. I would have much rather used dowels here so you don't see the pocket holes, but I was on a deadline. Sometimes that's just the way things go. So I strategically place the pocket holes where they'll be hidden once I add the shelves, which means for this one, I'm using stationary shelves, but we'll get there in a second. And again, with the sanding. Always with the sanding. Once my 2 side panels were together, I cut some 1x2s and a piece of 3/4 inch plywood for the bottom shelf. Fun fact, these 1x2s came off of a previous project. I like to recycle what I can, so I had to sand off the existing stain. Another fun fact, I actually ended up staining the shelf the same stain color, so I could have just left these. Oh well. Anyway, I added one of these 1x2s at the bottom and then 2 of them at the top. Then I installed the bottom panel. As you can see, this bookshelf is quite different than the other two. I think it's fascinating. Maybe that's too exciting of a word. I think it's neat that there's so many different ways to go about building a bookshelf, or a dresser, or a bed, or fill in the blank. Some are way simple and some are way complicated, but the end result is simply a place to put your stuff, and that just boggles my mind. Anyway, I've said this before, but the router is my least favorite tool in the shop. I don't know why, but I usually try to avoid it when possible. It's just a me thing. But I already showed you how you can just staple on a back panel, so I figured now I'll show you how you can install a recessed back panel too. So I installed a rabbiting bit into my router, and I cut a rabbet 1/4 inch deep around the back side of my shelf. The problem with this is it leaves rounded corners, and as much as I hate the router, I also hate chiseling. So you can chisel them square if you want, or you can cut the 1/4 inch back panel to fit, then round the corners with a jigsaw like I do. As long as you get the back panel to fit into the recess, feel free to pick your poison. Routing the back out allows you to recess the back panel so that you don't see the plywood edges. Sometimes that's nice on a freestanding shelf, and sometimes it doesn't really matter, like if the shelf is built in or it's going into a nook where the sides won't be seen. So depending on your preference, you can just staple back on or you can recess it. Next, I added a top. I cut this from plywood and I edge banded the sides, but another confession. Because this was a rustic style shelf, I would have preferred to glue up a solid pine top, but that pesky deadline didn't allow me the time to do that. I think a solid wood top would be a really neat modification and would give it a little bit more of a rustic feel. Then, similar to the last shelf that I shared, I cut to fit and added some trim to the sides. And then the last part was simply adding the shelves. Because I was using these to hide my pocket holes in the side panels, I made them stationary. If I had glued up the sides using dowels, I would probably have just added shelf pins here for adjustable shelves. But again, there are 100 different ways to go about this, and I chose to make this work. And just like that, this super simple, slightly rustic style shelf is ready for stain. And I have one more confession. I opted to stain this using a water-based stain, and I love water-based stains, but it's best applied to individual pieces before assembling, not a fully finished project. It dries super fast, so it's difficult to get an even layer on without overlapping, and I'll be honest, this was not a great stain job. Honestly, I knew better than to attempt to stain this once it was assembled, but I figured I'd give it a try. My bad. I guess the bright side is that the imperfections on the stain do add a little bit to the rustic feel. The good news is a nice coat of paint will cover that right up, but all in all, the shelf itself turned out pretty cute. So if you're looking to build a shelf or two, I hope this video gave you a few ideas and some inspiration to get started. I also hope you'll stay tuned to the channel because I've got several more unique and exciting projects to share soon. Like seriously, can't wait. In the meantime though, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, happy building.